Hello, everyone. This is Peter Gunther. We have a slightly abbreviated xAPI Learning Cohort session today. We just have a recording because of some online webinar difficulties, but Megan Torrance is here with me, and we're going to give you the real meat of today's presentation anyhow. We're very sorry to miss your questions and miss that interaction, but we can use Slack afterwards to take care of that. So if you have any follow-up questions for Megan, please just use the main channel for that, and we'll be attentive to those questions and spend the next couple days looking for those and answering those. So we do have Megan speaking in a few moments about learning ecosystems and how they relate to xAPI. Just because this isn't a live session doesn't mean we wouldn't love your social. So please use the hashtag xAPI Cohort and feel free to tweet at xAPI Gnome and at mmtorrance for any comments on today's session. Just like the last couple weeks, we've streamlined things a little bit, and we will be doing an audio recording of this as well. So with that, we're going to jump right into the content, and we'll get to that cohort business at the end. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing Megan. You've heard from her already this cohort. Many of you are in the cohort because you've met her, you've talked to her, and she got you interested in xAPI. So I'm just going to turn things right over. Megan?
Thank you very much, and I'll echo the sentiments. Thanks everybody for being flexible with the recording this week and the lack of a live session. It worked out well that Peter and I are actually in the same space. You know, last time I was on the cohort, and something I typically do when I am at conferences, doing conference sessions, and had this actually at the training conference down in Orlando earlier this week, where we had a really rich and lively conversation about what is xAPI. And I used this image to lay out at a very high level and introductory level what that ecosystem is, right? So with xAPI, we have some new vocabulary words. So we have the learning record provider, and we have activity statements. And while your content and you may not be changing, maybe your content is changing because you're learning new things about it and about what's working and what's not working because of your data. Your learning record providers are sending data in this new grammar, this new way of speaking interoperably about the learning and the performance space. All of that gets put into a learning record store, which is the official name for the database that receives, holds on to, and then gives back when you ask nicely, properly formatted and properly authenticated xAPI data. So that data comes in as an activity statement, the learning record store, if it is a conformant learning record store, and we'll talk a little bit about that. If it's a conformant learning record store, it will accept properly formatted activity statements and reject ones that are not. You then, of course, because you have been doing things before xAPI came around, you have other and legacy data within your organization that you need then to manage together with your learning data in order to make something neat and useful out of all of this. So that's really, and you know, we haven't spent a lot of time talking about the learning record store so far. Most projects already have a learning record store set up, and you're rocking and rolling if that's what if you're active on a project team this cohort. But that learning record store, as was described to me by one of the LRS vendors, so this isn't me throwing shade on them, the LRS is essentially a dumb database. Its job is simply to accept, hold on to, and give back those statements. The really interesting, rich, variable, and flexible visualizations that you see in the commercial learning record stores, the action triggering and the interesting reporting that you get from those are all additional to the specification. Right? So those are things that they're doing in order to differentiate themselves and in order to basically charge a premium price on something that is an open source specification. So if you didn't want to buy one, you could make your own, and the directions are there for you. So that's a little bit about learning record stores. We're going to get into that concept in a bit. when we talk about the ecosystem writ large, there's really two parts, right? There's the sending and there's the receiving. And by now in the cohort, you are sending data. If you're working on a project, you are sending data. I see 5 basic ways in which we can get data into a learning record store. There are, certainly you can use your current e-learning authoring tools, or you can buy a different e-learning authoring tool. But the primary way, and actually I did this earlier at the conference this week, I said, tell me what authoring tools you have, and everybody had a product that if you publish your files out as xAPI, will send xAPI data. So that's really a really good entryway to get in and start using xAPI. Now, of course, if all you're doing is e-learning, you're missing a big part of the value proposition of xAPI, and that you can get outside of e-learning. Right, so you can get your product vendor to send data. Another thing I like to do when I go to conferences is to wander up and down the aisles in the expo, and I see something that's really cool, and I say, hey, does this send xAPI data? And my job is to poke at them, because a lot of times when they say, no, we don't, and I say, why not? And they say, because our customers don't ask for it, and our customers don't have a use case for it. So that's, I make sure that I'm in there doing that ask, and whether I talk to somebody, I'm doing that ask. And I'll show you some samples in a bit of ones who are. You can use an aggregator like xAPI Apps to assemble things that really aren't sending xAPI data into a thing that is. And so xAPI Apps is pretty nifty. I'll show a screenshot from that in a second. You can write some custom code, and I know there are definitely some projects on this cohort that are writing their own xAPI code and getting data from things that didn't historically send xAPI data. And then you can import from business data. And this probably isn't a long-term solution, but you can certainly export out of many common enterprise-wide systems, export activity into a CSV file, and then use any number of CSV converters to format that as xAPI data and import that in. So as you look at all the providers in your ecosystem, there's a few things that you'll want to keep in mind, right, as you're moving from the single project into an ecosystem or an enterprise-wide environment, right? One is to make sure that you have the actor ID properly identified and consistently across providers, right? So whether that is a single sign-on environment, whether it is a launch from a common platform that will send that data, if you are getting data in from your e-learning using one actor ID and data in from custom software that you've built, you're importing it, and everybody in your Salesforce.com system uses a different person identifier, you're going to struggle to make any sense out of that data. You'll also want to make sure that your activities are organized. And I know Andrew Downs in a few weeks will be talking about, how do we go about organizing all of these activity IDs and all of this data so that we can get something meaningful out of that. And I'll let him talk about that when he comes in, because he's got a really nice presentation lined up. But these are some of the things as you go from a single proof of concept project for a single topic, and you start looking enterprise-wide across all the different things that we're training on and all the different ways in which people are performing on the job. So I know we've talked about some of these very early on when we were talking about what xAPI is, and I mentioned it a couple minutes ago. It is highly likely that you, as you are watching this, see a brand name for a product or products that you already use. So you already have the ability to send xAPI data out of these packages, right? Typically what you're going to find is you're going to get most of them out of the box. They're going to do very SCORM-like kinds of transactions. Domino, Lectora, Smart Builder are going to do, they'll give you a lot more granularity about the things that are happening on the screen without code. And with some JavaScript or with xAPI, which of course I can't pronounce or can't spell properly on this slide, you can extend the capabilities of many of these tools to be able to get data about any action or trigger that you want. So one thing I want to call out on the left here, the Learning Solutions article that Robert Penn and Paul Schneider just put out, it is absolutely an amazing resource. It goes down in gory detail. Seven? Something like that. Different activity providers, e-learning authoring platforms, and what they send out of the box, which is pretty awesome. And then, what you can do with JavaScript to extend that also helps. Other things that may be in your ecosystem that aren't really e-learning, right? So Curator from HT2, Flip from Mercury. These are two packages and two learning experiences that aren't what I would consider straight up e-learning, right? So Curator really supports social learning, almost a MOOC style approach. Flip is a flashcard based cards index micro-learning support, mostly from a mobile perspective. And so I don't think of them so much as authoring tools, but gosh golly, they're handy resources in my learning ecosystem and in the quiver of tools I have at my disposal as an instructional designer. And they both use xAPI. So they are automatically, within that scope of how do I get data about the learning experience into my my ecosystem, right? And then xAPI apps, right? Where at the top you've got checklists and self-assessments and a bunch of interesting things that are sending xAPI data natively. And then at the bottom of this list, there are a bunch of things: YouTube, Wistia, Vimeo, SlideShare, Prezi PDFs, online videos, articles, and just links to stuff that I can stitch together in a coherent learning pathway, like you see here, and send some limited xAPI data about all of these things. So people often ask me, hey, does YouTube send xAPI data? I'm like, well, not exactly. You can wrapper it, you can embed it in something, or you can use xAPI apps to stitch all that together. Right? So I mentioned tools in your ecosystem that may not be, they're certainly not e-learning tools, but they are often in the tool set that instructional designers use, right? But Survey, Gizmo, and Kaltura are both actually tools that are outside of the learning and development space, but they support xAPI because someone asked them to. So you can do this too. So call up your vendors and say, hey, can you send xAPI data? Can you get inside my ecosystem? Right, because what was actually super interesting, when I was at Tech Knowledge a few weeks ago, I actually talked to a product vendor who I've known for years. And very early on, I said, wow, this is a really cool tool. Does it send xAPI data? And he's like, yeah, it's not really relevant to us. Or, yeah, we have our own analytics and really useful things. I'm like, darn, because I'd really like this inside my xAPI ecosystem where I have all my data together. And sure enough, at Tech Knowledge, he came up to me and he said, you know what? I get it now, and I want to be inside the ecosystem, and I want my data alongside all the other ways in which people are learning about a particular topic. So that is super, super exciting. And there's lots and lots of things going on that sending side of data. The next piece, though, that really gets into ecosystem and really gets into the space where we now need to bring in most organizations, our IT team, and start looking at what that overall platform support on the receiving end of the data actually looks like. Right? So we have lots and lots of hands and lots of pipettes dropping in data and lots of activity statements, but we need a coherent plan. Before we get too big, we need a coherent plan for where we're going to put all that data and what it looks like. So I don't know about you, but the first time I heard that there was such a thing as a learning record store, I thought, oh, LRS. Sounds like LMS. Maybe it replaces my LMS. And I know a good, reliable laugh line in our industry is just how much everybody loves their LMS. It's like the common topic of discussion, right? And so I often find it really valuable to take a look at what the LMS does for you today. And in most time I talk to people about this, about half the people in the room have more than one, sometimes 3 or 4 or more LMSs that support their organization, right? Because you maybe got an LMS because it came with a particular content library, or you have an LMS that Your operations team stood up by themselves because they either didn't know that HR could support them and training could support them, or they needed to roll their own and they had that kind of clout in the organization to just go and get one. Or your sales team in the organization has a sales-specific LMS, and a lot of those tend not to be even SCORM conformant, right? But your typical corporate LMS today has users. It has courses and classes, and the combination of a user with a course is an enrollment. And data about that is stored as SCORM data, as well as other data within the LMS, right? Because you have you have the ability for the LMS to hold on to things about instructor-led training or documents or video or what have you that aren't really SCORM, but they're in the LMS. And so out of this, most LMSs don't do all of these things, but most LMSs do more than users, courses, enrollments, and reports, just in order to differentiate themselves. There are hundreds of LMSs on the market at all sorts of different price points and all sorts of different functionality, feature, and love factors. From an ecosystem perspective, most LMSs are set up to receive an automatic feed of users from a place, and that other place is usually the single source of truth for who are our users. So that's often either an HRIS, a payroll system, or a customer relationship management system, or a CRM. So there's a source of who are our people. Or if you're an association, right, there's an association management system, and that has the who are our members. And that comes in, and that's what drives that feed of users. And that system is typically the one that defines what is the hierarchy and what are the types of users that there are. Who reports to whom? Who sits in what office, what job roles do they have, and it allows you in an LMS perspective to be able to target your learning in a really careful way. Keep in mind, an LRS, a learning record store, just receives, hangs on, and gives back, by specification, that data. So that rich and complex look at who users are and what types are they is often something that your LMS has for you that your LRS may not have as much visibility to. So how do I go about adding xAPI into this environment where I often have a multi-year contract with one of these things, and replacing these things is actually a beast of a project, right? So one approach is to get another one of these things, these learning management systems that has an LRS inside. And that is a perfectly reasonable approach. It means you just swap out one system for another, or you wait until your LMS starts supporting xAPI with an LRS inside. And then you get kind of the best of all worlds. You get to have a managed training environment within the learning management system, and you get to keep data and store data about what's happening outside with that LRS. I'm going to pause for a second, right, and make a point here that keep in mind a conformant LRS as defined by ADL, and I have a link for that in a bit. A conformant LRS is going to accept statements from outside the LMS too. So while we're all saying in the industry, and it's very popular to say that the LMS is dead, the LMS is no longer the center of our universe, people should be able to have learning wherever they find it or wherever they happen to be as they work through the workday. The LMS does often have a purpose, and the LRS needs to accept data from outside and all of those other places where learning might be. Now we see some environments where there's what we call the managed ecosystem. And so you may have multiple LMSs, multiple LRSs, multiple other best-in-breed tools that are providing all sorts of data. And xAPI is the glue. It's the little black lines that connect all these boxes together in an interoperable fashion. And this is something that in some organizations, people are like, oh my gosh, that's a lot to manage and all those handoffs. And in some organizations, this is exactly what they need. So this is definitely an approach. We had one client a few years ago who was their entire learning ecosystem, where the bulk of their learning ecosystem was actually a WordPress site. It wasn't a WordPress LMS even. It was a content management platform, and that's how people found out about and used and got access to training. So implementing an LMS didn't make any sense for them. They put an LRS behind it in order to capture all that data. Okay? But there is some management support that goes along with this. This is what we see the vast majority of people adopting at this point. So they have their LMS. They're not changing it. They're not moving it. It's not moving anytime soon. And so rather than muck with it, they get an LRS, attach it or not to the side of the LMS, right? And then they can get all their fancy learning record providers and do all their rich and interesting data stuff over on the xAPI side of this, while leaving the stability that they need from their LMS alone. And they may collect up things that look like completions and upload them back to the LMS, so that if something that only exists in the xAPI space can report back to your master transcript. But in this environment, really the LMS is still king, but the LRS, the ability to stand one of these up very, very quickly, right? And if those of you who have already put together an LMS or LRS and stood one up for your project, they go up very quickly relative to an LMS. So this is a way for organizations to get in and get started. For example, I worked with a client that had an existing LMS infrastructure. It was hooked into their HRIS. They liked everything there. That particular company is not moving to xAPI in the meantime. But they had a compelling use case to have an additional rich data and to use xAPI for a particular large project. So we worked with them to get an LRS. We have multiple learning record providers alongside. And actually, in that case, the e-learning inside the LMS actually tracks SCORM back to the LMS and sends xAPI data to the LRS. So for that program, the single source of truth actually happens to be the LRS rather than the LMS. So we have all of the learning record providers pointing in there. This is because of its, it doesn't rock the boat, because it's very easy and quick to stand up. This is what we see, I don't know, Peter, the vast majority of our clients doing.
We've had multiple conversations and with xAPI as well. When people are coming up with most of our xAPI customers to date are coming with sidecar questions. They have an LRS alongside their existing LMS. And part of that is the people who just have an LMS with an LRS, they don't have support questions, whereas the people with the sidecar are coming because that's a newer feature for us. But all kinds of organizations, from furniture makers to major technology companies, we're seeing the sidecar approach all over the place.
And that's good. And in a minute, we'll get to all of the standalone LRS vendors who really are the vendors who have led the industry in bringing xAPI and making it this easy to use, actually. So look at this. Same picture, different title. So what we're also seeing is that there are several LMSs that actually are activity providers. So rather than embedding an LRS inside, these LMSs are saying, great, get us and we will send all of our data to your LRS. So it's the exact same configuration as what we call the sidecar LRS, right? Your LRS on the side. But instead, the LMS becomes an activity provider. And we'll talk about some of the LMSs that do this. Even to the point where in some situations, the LMS or the LMSs become secondary. This is definitely a case where you've got multiple LMSs or you have a really strong xAPI ethos in the organization. And in this case, what we do is we have the LMSs sending their data to the LRS. So if you're in an environment, right? I'll pause here for a second. If you're in an environment and you're the LMS administrator and you've got multiple LMSs, to be able to say, hey, show me all the training that Peter Gunther has ever done here. I'd have to run reports out of 5 different systems in some organizations. And that's just not feasible, particularly if I'm a compliance-heavy kind of system or environment, right? Or I've got lots of things going on. If we want to know the entire development picture for Peter over time, to have to pull that out of 4 different places is a pain in the neck. Or Peter goes in and he talks to a supervisor and he has a regular performance review. What have you done for training this year? And they have to look at 3 different systems in order to figure that out. So that's just not tenable. In this case, what we have is multiple LMSs then providing data to the learning record store, and the xAPI environment becomes that single source of truth in your master transcript. Okay. So let's add on another piece of software, and in many organizations, another business function. So in organizations where there is a strong data warehousing and business intelligence team, we find a situation like this tends to work. Now, here's what's interesting. We were working with an organization that does have, I mean, it's a business whose business is data. And they have certainly client-facing data support, but internally, all their decisions are data-driven, and they have a strong, as you can imagine, data warehousing and business intelligence group within that organization. And that group, super great guys to work with, came to us and said, well, what's the point of this additional piece of software? Why would we bother getting an LRS? Actually, Peter was on the phone with me at the same time. We were kind of scratching our heads, and we said, well, if you have an LRS, we can promise that all your data will be clean, right? So that enforcement function that LRS does, make sure that everything coming in is a valid statement. And the data guys said, yeah, we deal with dirty data all the time. Not a big deal. I'm like, oh, well, maybe you don't need an LRS, right? So because if you think about it, since not every L&D tool sends xAPI data, in that case, maybe the LRS was going to slow them down. But then we did a little bit more thinking about it. And here's the thing, right? Remember, an LRS is also supposed to give its data back when you ask nicely. Data warehousing doesn't necessarily do that other than to provide visualizations and business intelligence and fuel AI and other things. But as far as learning record provider to learning record provider, if they're pooling their data in the learning record store, for example, I could have one e-learning course send xAPI data and another xAPI experience pull data out of the LRS, and the LRS is designed for that. The data warehouse is not necessarily designed for that, and it's definitely not designed to make that easy from learning and development tools. And what we also found was that the learning and development team really liked the fact that if they needed a new report, needed a new visualization, had a new question about the data, they could do self-service within their LRS environment and not have to be yet another business function knocking on the door of the business intelligence team. So this is the environment they're setting up. And looking at what their options are. So that was really a good aha for us. So let's get down to what some of your options are. I think the most important parts of the next few slides I'm going to show you is that is the text that you'll see in little red bars. The list is incomplete. It is growing and changing on a regular basis. But we have a really, a solid group, not that there's not room in the industry for more, but there is a solid group of learning record stores that are conformant learning record stores. They do everything you expect them to do. They're going to get you data storage and retrieval, visualizations and reporting. Most of these vendors, all of these vendors have been at the table helping to define, advance, and educate people about the xAPI spec since the very, very early days. And so there's a lot of commitment here to interoperability. There's a lot of collaboration that has gone on. And these are great. Every organization has different sets of needs. However, every single one of these tools, actually I've recommended or have clients on on every single one of these. So a bunch of really rock solid tools in the industry that I see is good to have. This is at the bottom of the slide, the up-to-date list of conformant LRSs, and that's a great place to go to find out who has passed the official test. It's 1,300 some odd lines of automated testing that says you do everything that an xAPI learning record store should do. So that's good. These are for that sidecar, or when you have an LMS that is an activity provider, you're going to get one of these alongside. There are SaaS-based models, there are installed models, there are open source and support it yourself models, all of the above. There are build into if you're listening and you're an LMS provider and you need to build one in, you can build one of these in. If you are looking for one of those all-in-one systems, I did a search through a few weeks ago, and again, list is incomplete. This list is happily growing. I'm excited to see this list growing. These are LMSs that have LRSs that operate the way you would expect them to. They are conformant LRSs or almost conformant LRSs. And out of the box, for all of these, you will get not only everything you expect from an LRS, you will also get everything you expect from an enterprise-grade LMS, in addition to SCORM and AICC. So this is going to be a really interesting place. If you are shopping for a new LMS, I'm going to say start with this list, because you're going to want to, if you want to use xAPI out of the box and have that with your new LMS, this is where I would start. Another list of LMSs that, and I know it's incomplete. In fact, if you are from an LMS that's not on this list, or your LMS should be on this list or on the other list, by all means reach out to me and let me know, because I would love to keep updating these. I keep updating these every time I present these. But there are LMSs that have xAPI support. So there's an LRS inside, but for some reason it is not a full xAPI conformant LRS. So they're often what you're going to find, and I encourage you, call up your vendors. If you use one of these LMSs, call up your vendors, ask them how they support xAPI. My hope is that their support is evolving over time, and so you should get a better answer every month or two that you call. But out of the box, what we found is that these launch xAPI packages. So if you're using e-learning with xAPI, you can launch out of here. But that they may not, they may struggle with things, data that comes either from outside the LMS. They may struggle with reporting, or they may struggle with things that aren't e-learning. There are several types of systems that are going to be learning record providers. So they may support launches, but perhaps even more so, they're providing information about everything else that happens in that experience out to a learning record store. So this is a two-step purchase. You purchase these, and then an add-on, whether it's public or not public, but visible and at the forefront, or plays a quiet supporting role in the back. You'll need an LRS to go with these as well. And probably the best way to wrap up a conversation around the xAPI ecosystem is to really look at the fact that I've just spent the last, half hour. Good thing it wasn't a regular web session, because I would have completely blown your schedule, Peter. I've spent all this time talking about the learning environment, and yet the whole point of xAPI is that we're talking about things that are outside of just the learning environment. So your organization has a whole bunch of other functions that have data that's useful for your learning environment. And so you can be connecting those to your LRS. And then don't forget that there are systems outside your organization, and there are learning and performance data providers outside your organization that may be worthwhile to connect into your ecosystem from an LRS perspective. So let's continue this conversation in the main part of the xAPI Cohort Slack. If you are a member and active in there, certainly you can find me on email and Twitter as well if you'd like to either continue the conversation, ask some questions, or add to my lists of vendors.
Great. Thank you, Megan. Great presentation. And sorry that we don't get those questions live, but please do follow up with Megan and with me on the Cohort Slack and on Twitter, and we'll dive into your questions. So here we are kind of in the middle of cohort. I guess at the end of today's recording, we are at the halfway point. Week 6 of 12 is done. So maybe that little guy should be a little bit further along, but where I see a lot of teams is they are assigning tasks and iterating right now. Most active groups have their scope set. There are a few groups still figuring out that, which is fine and still doable. Take a little bit of a deeper look. We have 6 updates this week, and I'll hit those updates briefly. Thank you for getting those in, everybody. We'll spend more time on those teams, but I also wanted to point out activity on teams DartLab, Statement Box, Unity Game is starting to come back together. Visual has been plugging along all along, as has WordPress plugin. So just because they don't have updates this week, I do see that activity going on. So if you're still looking for a group, I would look at this dozen, the 6 that are up there, the 5 that I listed there, and then I just saw a message for Team Gamification that they're going to be getting up and running again. So those seem to be the dozen really active channels. A number of other channels I pinged and asked, is your team, going to do something this cohort? And have not heard a lot back on, or in some cases, people are saying, I'm taking a back seat. If new people want to come in, that's great. So you can feel free to check out those other teams, and maybe you do want to help get one of those others jump started. But lots of teams are at different places in their life cycle. Some have had very successful last cohorts, and they're a little quieter this time. Others are just getting started, and maybe they'll catch up. They'll take off next cohort. But these dozen really seem to be the active ones this time around. So with pretty much all of this dozen, I do see them having a weekly meeting now, talking about tasks and getting going on some things. So to the updates, Team Alexa is moving along. I updated those key contacts. Hopefully I got those right. That seems to be the main people active in the team this time around. Please message me if I didn't, or just post something on your Slack channel. But they are adding categories to their questions. They're adding more questions for review on Saturday. And then they will, on that VoiceFlow platform that they updated us on a couple weeks ago, they will actually start developing the Alexa skill. So looks like things are moving along well for that group. Team Captivate to LRS, and I apologized already to them that I missed their update last week. It was right after I put the slides up and before I had posted that slides were done. So they've been plugging along all along. They do have an account on StormCloud, which is their LRS, as well as has some LMS functions. And they did some testing there. Now they're looking at the Captivate file, and interesting problem we see a lot in different situations, depending on your ecosystem. Do you know where your learner's coming from? If it's a non-LMS situation, how do you capture that learner? And so they're adding a login screen, which will create the unique identifier. And they're moving along with those xAPI statements, looking to send additional data to the LRS from the Captivate module. So great progress there. Check in on their Slack channel if you'd like more detail. Team RPG Maker. Doug was largely doing this himself last cohort, and he's got a new influx of interest. A couple weeks ago, a couple more people came in with a lot of enthusiasm, and they had some great discussion. So the character of this team has really changed this cohort. It's great to see them moving along. They are making a new game from last cohort, and they've decided that principles of video production is their topic. So they're setting up some puzzles within their game. They're going to have a game with a very specific ending so that it can be expanded in the future. So if you're looking for a place to help out, there's still room in Team RPG Maker. Team SL360 to LRS is using Storyline, Articulate Storyline 360, to send xAPI statements. They're also using our tool, xAPI, and I appreciate the kind comments that have been made so far on xAPI. It looks like they're doing some parallel work. They have a number of people trying things out on their own, which is a cool way of doing it, and I see a number of people in that group getting things working and sharing knowledge with each other. So it looks like they're going to take what they've done and move on to a new activity. So sorry you guys didn't get a chance to do your update today. I do see your question here, Izzy. As you generate xAPI statements, you have questions about how to design them properly. On that, we have a great presentation coming up. Our schedule changed a little bit, and Andrew Downs of Watershed is going to be talking to us in, I think, 3 weeks, late March, about xAPI governance. And Megan already talked a little about that presentation, but how do you plan for your data? How do you get the cleanest data possible? So I know he's going to be talking about some of these topics already. Other quick thoughts for you. When should you use a category? What activity name? We have recommendations that we give that end up very in line with Andrew's recommendations on activity names. xAPI actually creates that for you, so you don't have as much direct control. But the key thing is your activity names are consistent and unique. So I made a mistake in a project last summer where I was copying and pasting between two activities, and I forgot to update the activity name, which means they shared the same ID, which means the data manually can be separated because they are very different question types. But it means our data is kind of garbled, and it's not very easy to tease out those two different activities. So you want to make sure that they are unique. That's the most important thing, unique and consistent. I'll poke around. There are a couple of deep dives and other resources out there that I'll share with you, but this is a huge topic, and it's not something that I can just do a 5-minute video for xAPI to talk about. That, in fact, would be a great project for a team, is coming up with some tutorials around making some of these decisions. But the other place I will point you to is the profiles that Jason talked about a week or 2 weeks ago. xAPI profiles often do specify this should be in the context. This should be a context parent. This should be a context grouping or category or other. So as you start to think about what your different activities are and you look for any existing profiles, they will give you some best practices as well. So hopefully that's enough to start on. It's a big question. I'd love to talk about it more. Team Twine is moving along, and I apologize. I started to update the contacts, and I know that Douglas is not the only key contact there, but I know that he was doing some JavaScript work with you. And in the middle of updating, I said, let me just ask the team who their key contacts are. And, didn't hear a response back yet. And I meant to leave that blank because I don't know all the contacts. So apologize about that. But members of the team are meeting to look at these technical issues around sending statements from Twine. If I'm following the discussion correctly, not having poked around in Twine anytime recently, there are different templates, and some of the templates support custom JavaScript in ways that others don't. And so the message that I saw looked like it was saying, we're going to try this in this other template now. Hopefully that captures it in a nutshell. It does look like you found a way to make that work. So now this team is working on another LRS and figuring out next steps. So really looking forward to seeing your progress and what's happening in Twine. Virtual Cohort, another team that's been plugging along right through the cohort. They have mapped their process flow now and the technical underpinnings. They've discussed and agreed on revisions. Now they're going to storyboard their learning experience, and they're going to keep building. So good progress from Virtual Cohort. And that was our last update for this week. Again, we do have a number of other active groups, so I encourage you to poke around and invite yourself into different channels if you're interested in finding a team, and just introduce yourself and ask them for an update. There's a lot happening this spring with xAPI, and what you're seeing on this screen is just the conferences. It's not even the workshops that are out there. Oh, I guess, yeah, there's at least one workshop up there. So depending if you're coming in, you're looking for a workshop, there are things there for you. If you're looking for more collegial sharing and case studies and what are people doing and best practices, there are some great conferences coming up where you can share that. But I especially want to focus on the one near and dear to our heart in the top right corner, the xAPI party. And I was going to jump ahead to this slide, forgetting there was one in the middle there. You're getting the raw uncut recording this week, just as normally you would in Adobe Connect. So the xAPI party is just over 2 months out. Please start making plans to join us. There will be 3 tracks running concurrently at the xAPI party. One of those happens online in Adobe Connect in the format more or less that you're used to. And yeah, we're crossing our fingers. Got to get that license straightened out. But if you can only participate online, please join us there. But if you can be here in Chelsea, we should have some great weather, hopefully. May is beautiful in Chelsea. There will be some beer present in the afternoon, and great food, great cookies, and great sharing. So if you can experience that in person, come on out to Chelsea. If you need help documenting that to your place of work in a way that doesn't say xAPI party, but really highlights its true nature as a conference with some fun, but with a lot of great learning, then please reach out to me and we will share some documentation with you. That's coming up on Thursday, May 9th. Why is it on a Thursday? Why not end the week with it? In the spring, we do a second conference, which is called the Torrance Learning Download. It's a similar format, but it's not just xAPI, it's instructional design in general. So if it helps the trip make more sense for you to come out for 2 days and get 2 conferences, I wanted to let you know that that's out there as well. Megan?
We'll have a call for proposals. It'll be out soon for there, but it is, we love, actually I was going to say it's expected. We love to have xAPI cohort projects featured as the predominant part of the xAPI party's schedule. So the party has some education sessions, just like a regular conference, but some of the most popular sessions are, full-on extended demos of what went on in cohort, what you learned, what you built, and so we will encourage all of you who are working on projects to submit for that. And, well, it's not like it's a proposal. If you submit, you're in, because we want to highlight what's going on in cohort. That's really the whole point of party.
And we do recognize that not everybody from cohort can make it out here to present, so there will be some possibility. There will be multiple slots to present remotely. Those online sessions don't have to be presented here, so we can have people attend here and also record, share online, and you're presenting online. So I cringe when Megan said if you submit, you're in, simply because if we get 12 teams that want to do that, we'll have to figure something out. But yeah, so don't think I can't present because I can't be there in person. So backing up a slide, here we are at the halfway point of the cohort, and in fact we're 60% done with the presentations, setting aside those last 2 weeks for team demos. But next week is the gentleman from Risk, Art Workington. If I pronounced that wrong last cohort, and I just learned the pronunciation today, but learned is the wrong word. I just heard the right pronunciation today. So Art and Duncan Welder will be joining us, and they will be talking about CMI 5. Jason hit on CMI 5 as a profile a couple weeks ago. It's one of the most important profiles, and so you'll get a good look at that and how it can make your xAPI data better with Art and Duncan. So really looking forward to that presentation. We are going to make that link work next week. I've got a couple ideas for how that's going to happen, But we will be back to the original link one way or another next week. So don't delete that bookmark. And one of these days I'll get the Slack automated reminder actually reminding, and it will share that link and it will work. So we will see you next week back on Adobe Connect. In the meantime, please catch up with us on Slack.